Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Danish decision to write a constitution that would cover the Duchy of Slesvig as well as Denmark proper led the Germans in the duchies to rebel against Copenhagen. The rebels argued that when Christian I became Duke of Slesvig and Holstein in 1460, he promised the duchies would always be governed together. Now when the Danes had broken that promise, the Germans and the duchies felt free to declare independence, which they did. This led to a 3-year-long war known in Danish history as the 3 Years' War. In German, it's known as the Schleswig-Holstein Uprising, and in English, it's rather ominously known as the First Schleswig War. Which brings us to today's episode. Episode 133, Ill-Fated Rematch. The 3 Years' War between Denmark and the duchies Slesvig and Holstein had ended in a kind of stalemate. Once the great powers, primarily Russia, had forced the Prussians to quit the war, the Danes had been stronger militarily, but neither side had been strong enough to force a complete victory. In 1852, they'd signed a peace agreement that no one liked. Now the conflict festered. In Denmark, the old Eder program, meaning the incorporation of all of Slesvig into the Kingdom of Denmark, was still alive and kicking. Many people, even some members of the government, were still dreaming of expanding Denmark to the river Eder. It may seem weird that the Danes were so hell-bent on not letting go of the southern parts of Slesvig, even though it had been Germanized. But this region was important to Danish history and to Danish national identity. Two concepts that were so much more important then than they are today. The old city of Hedeby, arguably the most important urban center in Viking Age Scandinavia, was located in southern Slesvig, and so was the Dannevirke fortification. The Danes had started the construction of this defensive line to keep invaders out 2,500 years ago. Giving up these locations, loaded with historic and national symbolism, would be political suicide for any politician, but making them fully Danish again would require another war. And more Danes were coming around to the conclusion that another war was not only inevitable, but even desirable. Someone else who wasn't averse to the idea of a rematch to settle the question of the duchies once and for all was Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian Chancellor. When he'd been new at the job in 1862, he gave his famous blood and iron speech, basically saying that Germany needed to solve its problems with blood and iron, not talks. More specifically, he wanted a united Germany under Prussian dominance, and he thought a war with Denmark over the duchies could help galvanize German patriotism and boost Prussian prestige. Bismarck, with the support of the new Prussian king, William I, then went on a shopping spree, beefing up the already pretty beefy Prussian army. He also managed to close a deal with the Habsburgs, securing Austrian support if there would be another war over Schleswig and Holstein. An important part of the London Protocol that had ended the First Schleswig-Holstein War was that the Danes had to limit their new constitution to only include the Kingdom of Denmark up to the so-called King's River. In the duchies, the ancient estates were re-established instead, and they were now even given the authority to make decisions, something they hadn't enjoyed under the absolutist system when they'd only been able to advise their reigning duke, the King of Denmark. But even though they were given more power than before, the politicians in Kiel weren't happy, because issues concerning foreign policy, the army, the navy, the customs, and the postal service were still handled by the Council of State of the unitary state, where representatives from Denmark and the duchies sat together and made joint decisions. The problem, as far as the Germans were concerned, was that the Danes were in the majority, 6-4, in the council, meaning that they could ignore the Germans if they wanted to. German nationalists in Schleswig and Holstein also felt that an 1850 decision to grant equal status to German and Danish in Schleswig was an affront to the honor of the far superior German language and culture, which, in their view, should have the right to expand at the expense of the inferior Danish tongue. German nationalists in other parts of the German Confederation tended to agree, and were upset by the way they felt the Danes rode roughshod over the Germans in Schleswig and Holstein. As a consequence, the estates in Kiel never ratified the political system put in place to govern the unitary state going forward. As I'm sure you can guess, this did not go over well in Copenhagen, and it did nothing to lower the political temperature. As the tension mounted, the Danish national liberals once again turned to their Scandinavian neighbors for support. Fortunately for the Danes, Swedish-Russian relations that had been surprisingly cordial after the war in 1809 were now strained due to Russian demands to establish a permanent presence in a bay in northeastern Norway. This meant that the Swedes were happy to cultivate ideas of mutual Scandinavian support again, both against the Russians and the Germans. So, Scandinavism made a political comeback. Even the hopes of a united dynasty was rekindled, even though that guy Christian had been bumped up the line of succession as a part of the London Protocol. In 1856, students from various universities in Scandinavia met in Uppsala to drink and give their usual fiery speeches, and as a part of this event, a delegation was even invited to Drottningholm Palace outside Stockholm, where King Oscar I addressed them. In his speech, he made the widely reported remarks that war between Scandinavian brothers would never again be possible, and their swords were ready for a united defense. King Oscar even started to work diplomatically to convince the other great powers, especially France, to support Scandinavist ambitions in Schleswig, since they had a common enemy in the Germans. Emperor Napoleon III didn't reject the idea. After all, any policy that might limit German power on the continent must be a good policy. And for those of you who wonder what happened to the Second French Republic that was established in the last episode, it has already collapsed and been replaced by a second empire, governed by Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, also called Napoleon. But this isn't the French history podcast, so I won't go down that rabbit hole here. In late 1856, King Oscar not only met with students, he also sent a diplomatic mission to Copenhagen with the task to establish and cultivate Scandinavist connections in Denmark. In March 1857, the King of Sweden even offered Denmark a formal defensive alliance, but Frederick VII rejected the proposal, since the alliance would only include the Kingdom of Denmark and Slesvig, not Holstein and Lauenburg. Still, this kind of talk from the King of Sweden stiffened the resolve among Danish politicians, who now banked on military support from Sweden and Norway in case of a new war with the Germans. In 1859, Oscar I died and was succeeded by his son, Karl XV. When he met with Frederick VII of Denmark in 1863, the new Swedish king made an oral commitment to establish that defensive alliance between their two countries, including all the duchies. A few months later, the temperature in the conflict over the duchies rose dramatically again after the Danes presented the so-called November Constitution on the 13th of November 1863. This piece of legislation once again tied Schleswig closer to Denmark. Of course, this decision went against the explicit conditions set down in the London Protocol that ended the 3 Years' War. The Germans and the duchies could not accept that. They made it clear that if the king signed the November Constitution into law, that would be seen as a declaration of war. And they had the backing of Otto von Bismarck and many other Germans throughout the German Confederation. In the middle of all this building tension, King Frederick VII felt he needed to do his bit. So he went down to Dannevirke, the ancient defensive line in Slesvig, to boost morale among the Danish troops stationed there. Against the advice of the military professionals, Danish politicians had insisted on placing most of the kingdom's defensive resources along the Dannevirke line. By now, there were some 30,000 Danish troops stationed there, waiting to get their morale boosted by the king's visit. That was a lot of soldiers, considering the fact that the Danish army only had some 38,000 men. Unfortunately, to properly man the Dannevirke line would have required 50,000 soldiers, so they were at least 20,000 short. I guess you can see why the military experts thought this whole setup was a bad idea. Anyway, they soon had other things to worry about. You see, King Frederick wasn't in particularly good health at the time. I mean, he had been suffering from bad health for a long time due to his lifestyle, but this time it was worse than usual. While inspecting Dannevirke, the king fell ill and had to be brought to nearby Glücksborg Castle to recuperate. He didn't get better though, and instead he lost touch with reality, deliriously shouting orders to soldiers he thought were present in the room. On November 15th, 1863, only 2 days after the text of the so-called November Constitution had been finalized, Frederick's body couldn't go on anymore. The king died, right in the middle of one of the worst crises in the country's history. I have to say, the last few Danish kings have had a knack for dying at the worst time possible. Now, because the king was so fat, he required a huge coffin, and it couldn't be carried down the circular staircase in the castle. So they had to winch it down through a window. The coffin was then shipped off to Copenhagen, where Frederick would be lying in state. But already on the way, the body started to decompose, so they had to drill holes in the coffin to let out some of the gases that were threatening to burst the lid open. When the coffin containing the enormous and enormously popular king reached the capital, large crowds came to take a last farewell. Thousands came to pay their respects at Christiansborg Palace, where the decaying corpse was lying in state. The stench in the hall was apparently so overpowering that they had to keep buckets of bleach in the room to try to mask the smell. The windows were also kept open, despite the inclement weather in Denmark in November. Beyond the more grotesque physical aspects of the event, Frederick VII had died without leaving any heirs. That meant that his father's second fear also came true. Frederick didn't just botch the process of abolishing absolutism, he also ended the dynasty that had ruled Denmark for more than 400 years. But, as we covered last time, this exact scenario had been covered in the London Protocol, and there was a line of succession in place that was clear, even though it was stretched pretty thin. Since old Uncle Ferdinand had died before Frederick VII, the crown now passed to Prince Christian of the cadet branch Slesvig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg, who became Christian IX when he ascended the throne. The new king, Christian IX, was in a bit of a tight spot. He was born and raised in Slesvig, and even though he'd spent many years in Copenhagen, he also knew the duchies and other German principalities. This meant that he was well aware of what the German reaction would be if he signed the November Constitution. But now he was the constitutional monarch of Denmark, and even though he feared the consequences, he felt he had no choice but to sign the document into law, which he did on November 18th, just 3 days after he'd become king. The German reaction was as immediate as it had been predictable. It didn't just upset people living in Slesvig and Holstein. The German Confederation passed a resolution calling for the conquest of the duchies to save the people of Slesvig from direct Danish control. This was all Otto von Bismarck needed to hear. He immediately started to prepare for the invasion. The Danes realized that if the Prussians invaded, they wouldn't be able to hold on to Holstein. And frankly, that wasn't the duchy they were interested in anyway. So they ordered the army to withdraw and regroup behind the Danevirke line. On January 16, 1864, Bismarck issued an ultimatum to the Danish government. Scrap the November Constitution within the next 48 hours, or we'll invade. The Prussians obviously wanted the Danes to reject this demand. That's why they'd given them so little time to react. But the Prussians needn't have worried. Even if the Danes had had enough time, the Danish government would never have abandoned the November Constitution. Bismarck was delighted. Prussian and Austrian troops now marched into Holstein unopposed and were even met as liberators by the German population there. The first shots of the war weren't fired until February 1st, when the Prussians and Austrians crossed into Slesvig. The invading Prussian army consisted of some 38,400 soldiers. The Austrians contributed 23,000. That's 61,400 men against the 38,000 the Danes had. Not the best odds for the Danes. Another factor that indicated that this would be a tough fight for Denmark was the fact that the international situation had changed considerably since the last war. Crucially, the Russians weren't so keen to get involved this time, after they'd gotten their nose bloodied in the Crimean War. Also, that war had put some serious strain on the Russian-British-French alliance that had forced the Prussians to back down last time. The Russians weren't willing to work with the Brits now, and France was unwilling to commit to fighting the Prussians and the Austrians without the support of the other great powers. And Britain only had its navy, so they were pretty useless in a land war. So the Danes were alone, except for the Swedes, who had promised to come to their aid in the spirit of Scandinavism. But when push came to shove, the Swedes didn't want to stick their necks out and send troops to assist the Danes if all the great powers stayed out of the fighting. All the great powers except Prussia and Austria, that is, and they were fighting against Denmark. So the Swedes reneged on the king's pledge and let their Scandinavian brethren in Denmark down, for the second time in 13 years. When planning for this new war, the Danish military under the command of General Christian de Meza had wanted to establish fortified positions along the coast of Slesvig and southern Jutland. Using these bases, they'd be able to ship troops along the coast and deploy them exactly where they were needed to inflict as much damage as possible on the invaders, as well as cut their supply lines. This strategy was possible because the Danish navy was still far superior to the Prussian one, and it went a long way to neutralize the superiority in numbers that the Germans enjoyed. The Danes had fewer men, but they'd be able to move them quickly, both to attack where they were needed the most and to avoid facing stronger German units. They hoped to use this strategy long enough for the great powers to get their act together and interfere on the Danish side in the conflict. It was a sound strategy, and it had every potential of working. But unfortunately, Danish politicians decided that it was more important to focus on the symbolically important Danevirke defensive line, and they forced the army to concentrate the bulk of its forces there, and not along the flanks of Schleswig and Jutland. It also meant that most of the resources that should have gone to the strengthening of the fortified positions along these flanks instead went to Danevirke. Don't get me wrong, the Danevirke line was a formidable defense, strong enough to withstand a frontal assault by a large army. But there was one problem. Apart from the fact that the Danes lacked some 20,000 men to defend it properly, the line didn't reach all the way from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. As long as the war was conducted during the summer, that wouldn't be a problem, because the Danevirke line was flanked by soggy marshland and bodies of water. But if an invader chose to attack during the winter, the undefended flanks would be frozen solid, offering a convenient way around the Danish defenses. And as I've already mentioned, the Prussians and Austrians attacked on February 1st. Still, the first attempt to circumvent the line was thrown back, but in the end, the Danish defenders were overwhelmed. General de Meza sent a telegram to Copenhagen informing the government that the army was abandoning the Danevirke and regrouping further to the north. Then he ordered the telegraph line to be cut, so no counter-order could get through. Leaving Danevirke was the only possible decision, and it saved the bulk of the Danish army, enabling it to fight another day. But the Danish politicians and public did not see it that way. Since it had been a direct violation of instructions from the government and against the strong public opinion in Denmark, General de Meza was relieved of his command and replaced by a more loyal colleague. There were even those who said that de Meza had abandoned Danevirke too soon because of who he was. You see, de Meza was of Jewish descent, even though the family was assimilated and his parents had even named him Christian. Still, some people were now muttering that he had abandoned Danevirke because, as a Jew, he failed to properly understand how important the position was to real Danes. The retreating forces regrouped on a peninsula close to the small town of Dybbøl, some 60 kilometers further north. This was supposed to have been a strong point in the original flank strategy. But since the politicians had favored the Danevirke line, it offered little real protection if the Germans would launch an attack, which they were now bound to do. So the army assumed they'd just regroup and then ship the troops from Dybbøl to some other place where they could be of more use, or at the very least to some place where they wouldn't be in immediate danger of being obliterated by the enemy artillery. But the government refused to let the military abandon Dybbøl as well. The Danish public would not stand for it, so the army would have to stand and fight, even though it made zero military sense. So, from the safety of Copenhagen, the government ordered the army to defend Dybbøl to the last man. By the way, if you need some help to keep track of the geography, as usual, I'll post a map on the region and the development of the war on social media, so Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, Anyway, the fortified position at Dybbøl had been meant to be a key part of the flexible flank attack strategy that the Danish military had originally wanted to use. But since so much of the resources had been poured into the Danevirke line, the Dübel position wasn't particularly well equipped for a German attack. For example, the shelters for the soldiers had been constructed from wood and earth. Only the storage rooms for ammunition were made with concrete. On February 7th, the evacuated soldiers from Dannevirke arrived. Almost 22,000 men had to squeeze into a position that was never meant to house more than a fraction of that number. The first Prussian units showed up the following day. By February 20th, there were over 20,000 Germans facing Dübel, but they didn't attack immediately. Instead, they started to weaken the Danish position with their artillery. They brought with them a newly developed type of siege gun with rifled barrels with long range that could hit exactly where they wanted, pulverizing the Danish defenses. The artillery blasted away at the Danes for weeks, and at the same time, the Germans were digging trenches that were creeping closer to the defensive line every day. But the Danes weren't completely defenseless. They still had their superior navy. They had more or less complete control over the waters and sent their new ultra-modern ironclad, Rolf Krake, to shell the German positions from the sea. The Prussians and the Austrians could do nothing to stop this bombardment, and when they tried to storm the Dübel position on March 28th, Rolf Krake played a crucial role when the Danes managed to push them back. This was a massively needed morale boost to the Danes. Some Danish generals even drew the conclusion that the Germans wouldn't dare to attempt another frontal assault on the Dübel position as long as Rolf Krake was shooting at them from the sea. They would soon be proven wrong. Instead of giving up, the Prussians brought up additional artillery that they'd been keeping as a reserve. On April 7th, the Prussians stepped up their bombardment of Dübel in preparation for the final assault. The Danish defenders could do little to stop them. For every day, they could observe the German trenches inching closer. On April 11th, even the new Danish commander, who had been appointed because he was considered more compliant by the politicians, asked the government to be allowed to evacuate the men from Dübel. They refused. After another week of German bombardment, on April 17th, the commander repeated his request, but it was denied again. During the weeks of German artillery fire, Dübel had become a symbol and a source of national pride. Giving it up now would be disastrous for general morale, not to mention the government's popularity. So the troops remained at Dübel, and the following day, the Germans launched their final assault. That morning, the shelling intensified even further. 7,900 grenades were fired at the Danish lines in 4 hours. In the trenches, by now only 150 meters away, some 10,000 German soldiers were preparing for their attack. It was risky to pack so many men into the trenches. Well-aimed Danish cannon fire could have caused heavy casualties, but the Danes had few working artillery pieces left, so the Germans were willing to take the risk. In fact, they were so certain of success that they brought a marching band to play for the soldiers as they went over. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the German artillery suddenly stopped, and a few seconds later, the soldiers poured out of the trenches. The Danish defenders had almost no time to react before the enemy was upon them in overwhelming numbers. At one of the redoubts, 70 Danes were faced with 1,000 Germans. Even where the Danes weren't as ridiculously outnumbered, the pattern was the same. 13 minutes into the charge, the Germans had already taken over the first Danish line. The Danes were fighting a desperate fight, but still they hadn't given up. The 8th Brigade attacked the Prussians and stopped their advance long enough to let what was left of 2 other brigades withdraw down to the water. There, 2 pontoon bridges had been laid across the narrow strait to the island of Als. As many soldiers as possible retreated across the strait until the bridge had collapsed by 1:30 in the afternoon, and the bridges had to be destroyed. The Battle of Dübel was over. The Germans had suffered around 1,200 casualties. Not only were the Danish losses significantly larger, but they also had fewer men to begin with. 3,600 Danish soldiers were either dead, wounded, or captured. That was approximately 10% of the Danish army, lost in less than 4 hours. While the fighting was going on at Dübel, representatives from Denmark and the German Confederation were preparing to start talks in London on April 20th. Unfortunately for the Danes, their decisive defeat 2 days before meant that they came to the negotiating table with a considerably weaker hand than they had hoped for. The Danish negotiating team was led by Ditlev Gotthard Monrad, who was the president of the Council of State, so basically the Danish prime minister. He had feared exactly this outcome, and that's why his government had refused all the requests to evacuate Dybbøl. The Germans, for their part, had obviously timed the final assault on the Danish position to strengthen their position in the negotiations. During the peace talks, it was suggested that the easiest way to solve the conflict would be to simply divide Slesvig into a southern German part and a northern Danish part. The Danish half could then be incorporated into Denmark, and the rest could join Holstein and become a part of the German Confederation. Considering the fact that the Germans currently controlled all of Slesvig, except for the island of Als, you might consider this a generous offer. But the Danish negotiating team, under the leadership of Council President Monrad, refused. The Danes still insisted on the River Ader forming the southern border of Denmark. So the talks led nowhere and the fighting resumed. And then things started to unravel fast for the Danes. During the negotiations in London, Danish troops, who had retreated first from Dannevirke and then from Dybbøl, stayed on the island of Als, separated from the Schleswig mainland by a narrow strait. The 9,000 Danish soldiers had spent the pause in the fighting fortifying their side of the strait with artillery positions and trenches. The Danish navy patrolled the waters surrounding Als, making sure no Germans would be able to cross. The patriotic owner of the land on the mainland side of the strait had offered to cut down the woods on his property, making it easier for the entrenched Danes to shoot at any German troops that would try to approach the strait. But the Ministry of War had declined the offer, arguing that it was highly unlikely that the Germans would try to come across to the island from that direction. In the days that followed the end of the negotiations in London, the Prussian command gave the order to cross the strait to Als in the short night between June 28th and June 29th. The Prussians used the intact woods on their side of the strait to hide their preparations from the Danes on the island, because of course they did. At 2 in the morning on June 29th, the Prussian soldiers boarded a bunch of small boats and started to row across the narrow strait. It would only take them a few minutes to reach the island, but before they had time to do that, the ironclad Rolf Krake once again entered the strait from the north and started to blast away at the more or less defenseless Germans. The crossing had to be abandoned, at least for a short while. Soon the Danish vessel withdrew, partly because of well-aimed German artillery fire, and partly because of mistaken intelligence that the Prussians had managed to cross over on a different location. As soon as Rolf Krake was out of the picture, it only took the Prussian troops 15 minutes to get across the strait, and even though the Danes fired all they had at them, the Germans captured the defensive positions almost immediately. The Danish troops retreated south and east. Eventually, all the Danes who didn't have time to be evacuated by ship had to surrender. About a third of the Danish soldiers on Als, some 3,000 men, were either killed, wounded, or captured that night. After that, there was really no stopping the Germans. They quickly advanced northward across the King's River into Denmark proper and continued to occupy all of Jutland. The last bit of fighting in the war took place on July 3, 1864, when a Danish company attacked a Prussian unit at Lundby, just south of Aalborg in northern Jutland. The Danes attacked with their bayonets downhill, but the attack was stopped some 20 meters in front of the Prussian line. It was a heroic last attempt to stop the invaders, but it was more of a gesture than a realistic plan. A gesture that cost the Danes 98 casualties. The Prussians only had 3 wounded. 11 days later, on July 14th, the Prussian general Edward Vogel von Falkenstein symbolically signed his name in the church book in Skagen, at the northernmost tip of Jutland. That signature symbolically sealed the occupation of all the Danish mainland. Only the islands were still not in German hands, and it seemed to be less of a question of if, but rather when, the Germans would capture them as well. In that situation, the Danish government had no other choice than to accept a ceasefire and return to the negotiating table, and now they were in an even weaker position than before. Once the negotiations started this time, it didn't take long to reach a conclusion. The Prussians and the Austrians could basically dictate the terms to the defeated Danes. Already on August 1st, King Christian IX renounced all his claims to the duchies Slesvig and Holstein, thereby losing the title Danish monarchs had held for over 400 years. This was then confirmed in the Treaty of Vienna, signed on October 30th. There were minor border adjustments, where Copenhagen had to give up enclaves of Danish territory inside Slesvig, but instead the Danes got to keep the island of Ærø, which had belonged to Slesvig but was located south of the island of Funen. This meant that Denmark lost 40% of its territory, and the population shrunk by 1 million people to 1.6 million. The unitary state ceased to exist, and Denmark was truly reduced to a mini-state. Just imagine, 50 years before, the King of Denmark had been the absolute ruler of a realm that had stretched all the way from the Norwegian Arctic to the border of the Holy Roman Empire. It had been one of the largest realms in Europe, ruled by one of the most ancient and prestigious dynasties. And now, this was all that was left, a minor power at the edge of the continent, with a king from a distant cadet branch of an extinct royal bloodline. Calling it a national trauma is hardly an overstatement. But still, it could have been even worse. Facing this catastrophic defeat, King Christian IX actually turned to the Prussians in secret behind the back of the government and offered that all of Denmark could join the German Confederation, as long as that meant that he could remain Duke of Slesvig and Holstein. But Bismarck rejected this idea. He was a shrewd politician, and he feared that the tension between Danes and Germans in Slesvig would never go away if he agreed to this proposal. As things stood now, he expected to be able to Germanize all of Slesvig. And there were few people who thought any differently. Even though many Danes mourned the loss both of the land and the population, the catastrophic defeat had brought home the bitter lesson that Denmark's days as a military power to count on was over. In fact, Denmark would not send troops to fight abroad again for more than 100 years. The next time the Danish military would be involved in operations abroad was in 1999, when the country participated in the NATO attack on Yugoslavia. Unfortunately for the Danes, though, that doesn't mean Denmark lived in peace between 1864 and 1999, but more about that in future episodes. Beside Danish militarism, another victim of the Second Schleswig War was political Scandinavism. Despite the fact that King Carl XV had promised to send troops to Denmark's aid, no Swedish or Norwegian military units had come to help their struggling Scandinavian brethren. The hollowness of all those solemn speeches was exposed for everyone to see, to Danish dismay and Swedish shame. Still, many Swedes, Norwegians and Danes wanted to keep the dream of Scandinavism alive. In the second half of the 1860s, several associations meant to strengthen pan-Scandinavian solidarity were founded, such as Nordisk Samfund in Denmark, Nordiska Nationalforeningen in Sweden, and Skandinavisk Selskap in Norway. Various intellectuals, artists, and academics still waxed lyrical about Scandinavian unity and solidarity, but political Scandinavism would never again gain widespread popularity. More importantly, practical steps were also taken to draw the Scandinavian countries closer together and to facilitate cooperation and integration. A Scandinavian Postal Association was established in 1869 and a monetary union in the 1870s. That meant that a Swedish crown would be worth just as much as a Norwegian or a Danish crown, and you could use the currency from one Scandinavian country in the others as well. This system survived for a surprisingly long time and wasn't formally abolished until 1972. Scandinavian jurists also started to meet up from the 1870s onward, leading to harmonization of Scandinavian legislation and even cooperation when developing new laws, especially in technical, maritime and commercial fields. These kinds of regulations may not be very spectacular, but this work was important and did a lot to facilitate day-to-day cooperation across Scandinavian borders, despite the failure of political Scandinavism. If you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's ShainKman. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.